Hey guys, my name's Simon and welcome back to the Aether Hub for more Magic the Gathering lore. With the story of Rivals of Ixalan behind us and Dominaria fast approaching, don't fret, I'll get to the rest of Ixalan, but I also find it's an appropriate time to revisit some of the recent events in Dominaria's history. We already know from some of the set's art that Karn, Teferi, and Jahora are all going to be some of the main faces we see in this new set. But, fun fact, did you know that Teferi was one of the first Planeswalkers in the lore to lose his Spark and survive? This is actually true, and it all happened in the events of the novel Time Spiral, where Teferi returns to Dominaria after 300 years, only to find his beloved home torn apart by time rifts. However, to fully understand that story, we first need to dive back in time to Dominaria's earlier years, and the war against the Phyrexians. That story begins, like most of the stories from that time, with the Planeswalker Urza. Urza, arguably the most powerful Planeswalker of all time, was an artificer who, after losing his brother Mishra to the corruption of the Phyrexians, had sworn to destroy Phyrexia and their leader, Yawgmoth. These Phyrexians aren't like the ones in the recent history of Magic. Unlike their latest iteration, these Phyrexians were made completely out of metal and sought to conquer Dominaria in the name of their master. And some of them were even powerful enough to overpower Planeswalkers, who were basically gods at the time. Needless to say, this band was a threat, and after years of fighting them, Urza had decided that he can't win this war on his own. If Yawgmoth had an army, then he would have to build one himself too. Towards that end, Urza and his friend, Barren, an extremely powerful mage in his own right, had constructed an academy on the island of Tolaria. This academy had served as a place of education, but its main purpose was to create Urza an army of mages for his war against Phyrexia. One of the students there was a young prankster named Teferi. Teferi was a brilliant student and quite the prankster, which got him into a lot of trouble. However, Urza saw the potential in this young mage, a potential that was unfortunately squandered when the Phyrexians found the island of Tolaria and invaded it. Although they were eventually defeated, Teferi and his friend, Jahora, were killed in the assault. In order to bring them back to life, Urza had to send Karn back through time via a time machine in order to prevent this event from occurring. This, however, caused more problems than it actually solved. While Karn was successful, there was a fault with the time machine. Of course, haven't you guys ever seen a time traveling movie? This resulted in it overheating and exploding, killing multiple students and cursing Teferi with a fate worse than death. Teferi's body caught fire in the explosion, but instead of dying, he got stuck in one of the multiple time rifts created by it. He was unfortunate enough to get stuck in a slower time rift, where time had moved much slower than in reality. And to make things worse, he caught fire prior to getting stuck, resulting in him essentially burning forever. This wouldn't last, as Teferi was later saved by his friends, and at some point after that, his Planeswalker Spark had ignited, turning him into a Chronomancer Planeswalker, a mage with the inclination of time magic, making Teferi the only one of this kind that we know of. Teferi went on many adventures over his time as a Planeswalker, and Urza had eventually introduced him to the threat that is Phyrexia. Unlike Urza, Teferi wasn't so keen on going to war with the Phyrexians and Yawgmoth, but he did want to protect Zulfur, his home, and Shiv, Jahora's home. So he came up with a plan. Despite Urza's protest that isolation isn't the answer and that he should stand and fight with his former tutor and fellow Planeswalker, Teferi did what he thought was best, both for his home and the people he cared about. Thus, he cast a powerful phasing spell that phased a good chunk of both Zulfur and Shiv out of time. This played out exactly as the keyword phrasing entails. Zulfur and Shiv were removed, but were still technically there, as in it wasn't removed from existence, just locked in another dimensional time bubble, leaving a hole in the time stream where they previously resided, and eventually it'll phase back in, returning and filling the hole. The Phyrexians would eventually be defeated, but not before Teferi left Dominaria, along with a very disappointed Urza. Now that you understand a little bit more about the history of the phasing of Zulfur and Shiv, and time rifts in general, at least those above Tolaria, you can start to wrap your head around the tale of how Teferi lost his Spark. Teferi wouldn't return to Dominaria for another 300 years, only to find the plane that he once called home a barren wasteland of mana. The cause of this drastic change in the environment was the death of Corona, the living avatar of Dominaria's mana. As a living avatar, Corona was the embodiment of all mana on Dominaria, and when she was betrayed and killed, almost all of the mana had died along with her, causing massive devastation all across the plane and leaving the plane barren, unable to heal itself. With no mana to keep the plane stable, time rifts became much more common, and a much bigger problem, one that Teferi had sought to solve, despite that not being the original reason for his return to Dominaria. No, Teferi didn't know about the devastation of his home plane until he saw it for himself. What he came to do was to phase the missing lands back, believing that enough time had passed for them to safely phase back into reality. Unfortunately, Teferi would soon discover that wasn't exactly the case. Even worse than that, the phased out kingdoms began to slowly phase in and cause severe damage to the plane. At first, it was unknown to Teferi what had happened, but after him and Jihora inspected the area, Teferi understood how and why this was happening. Imagine a box in front of you. This box represents Dominaria, and it has many triangular-shaped holes on it. Each of those holes is filled with a triangular-shaped element. One of those elements is, for example, Shiv. When Teferi phased out Shiv, he took out the element, leaving an empty hole in the box. Instead of putting it back in its place, Teferi went to play with different toys. While he was away, Corona came and smashed the box into pieces, reshaping the holes in the process. What was once a triangular hole is now twisted and distorted, and the elements have twisted along with it, all except one. These elements are innately part of the box, and the box wishes to be whole once more. In order to do so, the box starts drawing the missing elements back into its place. But because Teferi had took it out and Corona had changed the shape of the hole, the element no longer fits. The hole is different now. What was once a triangle is now a circle. Regardless, the box is forcing the elements back in and causing damage to itself. This is what essentially was happening on Dominaria. Shiv was facing back into its place, but the plane that had once belonged had undergone a drastic change, and now the kingdom is not just out of place, but it's out of time as well. If it keeps trying to fit into a hole that it doesn't fit in, it will eventually cause so much damage to the plane that it might even lead to its very destruction. This situation, along with the distortion of mana on the plane, had caused Teferi both great confusion and fear. Instead of confronting his mistake, he sought ways and excuses to avoid it. At first, he believed that the answer in fixing all of this lied in two new potential planeswalkers, Rada of Keld and Venser of Urbog, for the nature of their spark was different somehow. Although it still hadn't ignited, Teferi could sense that the two had the potential to become planeswalkers, and he sought to train Rada, for she had more use in his goals than the ever-frightening, kinda wimpy Venser. Regardless, Teferi sought out more excuses and more distractions from the actual problem, to the point that he left Jihora, Rada, Venser, and the rest to come up with some kind of solution. I mean, Dominaria is a big place with a lot of areas devoid of life. What could possibly happen to his companions in those few minutes, right? Oh, I don't know. How about Nicol Bolus comes back from the dead and threatens to burn everyone alive? No, you're not losing your mind. Nicol Bolus did come back from the dead and tried to steal Venser and Rada away and ended up demolishing Teferi in a duel. Teferi and the others had only managed to survive because Teferi came to realize what was actually happening to the multiverse. Dominaria was close to dying, being torn asunder by the time rifts, and the mending was on its way. It's only when he informs Bolus of the upcoming changes to the Spark and the very nature of the multiverse that the dragon ended the duel and left the plane. Understanding that his friends need his help, and later seeing Rada slay a Cloudin warlord, achieving her goal of becoming a warlord of her people, did Teferi gather enough courage to step through one of the many rifts, fix his mistake, and bring Shiv, Jihora's home, back to Dominaria. This was no easy task, mind you. Teferi could feel the energy being drained out of him. It took him everything he had, every fiber of his being, to place Shiv properly back into the hole that had been left behind. In the end, it nearly cost him his life. Teferi managed to put Shiv back into place. However, he himself had changed, or better yet, something within him had changed. His Planeswalker Spark was gone, presumably consumed by the energies of the Time Rift, and for the first time in centuries, Teferi was nothing more than a mortal man. And that, you guys, is the story of how and why Teferi lost his Spark. Now that we know that Teferi is coming back in Dominaria and will certainly play a huge role in the story, will he return as a Planeswalker or not? I don't think we'll ever see him as a Planeswalker again. So far, we've only seen two other characters regain their Sparks, Karn and Ixalan. Karn's Spark was snuffed out by the Phyrexian corruption, and he only became a Planeswalker again because of Venser, who sacrificed himself, giving up his Spark to a golem he barely even knew. To date, this is kinda impossible because it's not how Sparks work. I mean, the entire character development of Memlark revolved around obtaining a Spark and transferring it from Gissa to himself. And that was impossible because the Spark isn't a physical thing. How Venser gave it away is tricky to understand. You know what's even more confusing? How Karn was once powered by an artificial heart, but is now powered by Venser's human heart. I know, confusing, right? No wonder Quest for Karn pretty much killed the line of novels. And the Ixalan example, well, he didn't lose his Spark, but he had it suppressed instead. Teferi flat out had his Spark consumed by a Time Rift, so I honestly doubt that he'll get it back, unless he has a reserve of willing sacrificial Planeswalkers lying around. Well, only time will tell. Anyway guys, that's all the video I have for you today. If you could, hit that like button, subscribe, and of course share it with your friends across the entire multiverse. As always guys, I'm Simon, and I'll see you next time here on the Aether Hub.